All right, at this point, welcome to our budget workshop. And we will stand and we will have a pledge of allegiance, and then we will have our roll call, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ready?
Roll call, please.
Yes, ma'am. Mayor Williams advised he would be a few minutes late. Vice Mayor James.
Here.
Commissioner Ambrose is absent. Commissioner Jones. Here. Commissioner Whites.
Here.
Okay, thank you. All right, with that, we will move into business item number 1, which is presentation of proposed FY 22-23 budget for the general funds departments. Take it away.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. Diane Wilson, Finance Director. So tonight we'll be talking just about the general fund, and then at our next meeting we'll talk about the utilities, wild spaces, CRA, the other funds outside of general fund. Just a reminder what our assumptions are going into this. We had an increase in the property tax over last year. We're assuming or budgeting that way. We did not make any changes in anticipation of anything new coming up, and we have included in these numbers a step placement for all our employees, so they're in the right step based on the pay plan, based on how many years they have of experience, and then applied 3% raise on top of that. So even the people who didn't have a step movement that were already correctly placed, they would see a 3% increase. Again, property liability, insurance are both very expensive along with fuel. We have aging vehicles and equipment, so we've seen some increases in our repair costs, and health insurance premiums are going up by about 8%. We've also gone through and reviewed all our positions to make sure that the employees are being billed to the right funds based on where they're working. So if you have somebody, let's say in Parks and Rec, that is working on some wild spaces projects and on regular city parks business, we want to make sure that they're funded out of both so that it's equitable. And again, just going through, we have a lot of new employees, new directors, and everybody's really spent a lot of time sitting down, going through line by line in the budgets to make sure that we're budgeting where we need to be in the right categories, so that helps us for future planning, and to make sure we have what we need to do business, that we're not going to have any, holes in our operations as a result of any deficiencies. So our general fund revenues are broken down into some major categories. You saw this data in a table last time. And obviously the biggest revenue that we get is taxes. So that doesn't include just the property tax, but also utility tax. So any of the utility companies that do business in town have to pay a 10% utility tax on their non-fuel portion of the bill. So Duke, Clay Electric, GRU for gas. And then the next largest component is the interfund transfers. So all of those other funds that I mentioned a few minutes ago do contribute back to the general fund. Intergovernmental is your revenue sharing from the state. So they share with us. And there's discretionary, and then there's also scheduled revenue sharing where we know what it's going to be each month. And then there's also discretionary revenue that comes in from the state based on what they're earning. Franchise fees, so those companies that pay us utility tax also pay us franchise fees to do business in the city. And then charges for services, that covers things like sports fees, when High Springs Police goes to UF and helps the football game and they collect revenue, those are considered fees for charges for services. Licenses and permits are mostly development type costs, not your building permits. That's in a separate fund. And miscellaneous revenue kind of has if someone makes a public records request and they have to pay for the copies. It's that kind of things that don't really fit in any of the major categories, and they're usually smaller dollar amounts. Grants are only about 2%. Again, that will vary year to year depending on what's available to apply for, what we actually get, and what we're able to use. And finally, fines and forfeitures, it says 0%, it's in the decimals. That's just a very small number, and it's mostly codes. Again, we haven't done a lot of that because we hadn't had someone in place to be the magistrate or to be a codes person. So we're, of course, moving in the right direction with that. So I won't go through every single line, but we revisit those categories I just talked about. You can see that there is an increase between the 22 budget and the 23 budget for the property taxes for ad valorem. I don't know why they have to call it that. It's just property tax, but just to sound fancy, I guess. And then communication services tax, that's like the taxes you pay on your cell phone bill, and those come in from the state. Motor fuel tax refunds. So as municipality, we do not have to pay tax on the fuel that we purchase, but when we buy it, we pay the fuel, and then we have to send in a form every month to the state to get that back. It's not a lot of money, but it's kind of like, oh, what is that? The rest of the categories are the items under license and permit, like I said, are mostly development and planning type expenses. Also, the alcoholic beverages license is in there, and certificate of appropriateness. I actually looked this up today because I didn't know what it was, and that is when you have to get a facade change approved to meet historical standards. So I learned something new today. And I think for the most part, the rest of them are pretty self-explanatory. And again, if you have questions along the way, feel free to interrupt me. That's totally fine. And again, state revenue sharing, you see that there's a sales tax component that's calculated at the beginning of the year, and we get it in equal installments throughout the year. And then the discretionary portion quarterly, we have a similar amount each month, and then quarterly we'll get kind of a little bonus payment, so that's nice. So you can see that in 22 we just budgeted a little low, and we're getting the full amount budgeted in 23. Again, with grants, they're really kind of a guess at this point until we get going with the year and see what's available to apply for. And then the franchise fees are a pretty significant amount at about $450,000, so those are really important to our budget as well. And there's an assumption that they're going to continue to increase their rates, and that increases the amount of franchise fees and utility tax that we receive. And then charges for services. As I mentioned, High Springs PD, we have the school resource officers in here. We did add First Christian Academy in the 23 budget, so you see that there's a difference between the 22 budget and the 23 budget. I think it's $53,000 a year is that contract. And we've also broken out police billable services. When, for example, we go to a football game and work that, and we get fees back from UF, before they've just kind of been mixed in with miscellaneous revenue, so I want to make sure we broke those out. That'll help PD budget so they know how much of their officers are being paid for with general fund money and how much from outside revenue, so we can charge appropriately. And fines and forfeitures, as I mentioned, most of it's going to be looking at code enforcement dollars, and so we'll really have to kind of play that by ear based on how we do with the magistrate in place. And then this one's a little small, sorry. Miscellaneous revenue. So of course we have the tag agency, agency work downstairs, and we do charge the state for that, and that's $75,000 a year. Our rental properties are in there, post office, farmers market, and civic center. And then we go into the interfund transfers. And again, the other funds all contribute to the general fund. Something that I'm still looking at is, so the cemetery fund has a separate trust that will help maintain the cemetery in perpetuity. And an allowable expense is what those maintenance expenses. Right now, we're paying it out of the general fund, but we could use the cemetery trust to pay for that employee and the supplies and fuel and mowers and all that good stuff, and that would help take a little bit of pressure off the general fund. So we are allowed to do that. I'm just still want to have some conversations with Ashley about that and look further into that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me. Under the proposed budget for 23, those columns where there are no numbers, does that mean that you don't anticipate any expenses for this year in those areas?
Yes, so those we're not budgeting any revenues coming in. It depends, it's either something that we're not certain about, that we may or may not have revenues there and we don't want to count on them, or that item is being captured in another line, or it's just something we don't do. So, for example, at the bottom where it says from fire fund to the general fund,
No, I was looking at some of the others, like it has a tree removal permit. And somebody's always looked like asking to remove a tree somewhere.
right, and those have, I think the revenues for that have fallen into another category, so they've kind of been lost in the noise. So we're
Okay.
trying to break these items out separately so that we can budget for them independently.
And the conditional use permit fees, same kind of thing?
Yep, yep,
Okay,
yes, ma'am.
all right.
Yep, that's a good question. And some of this has also been, as we've gone through the line items, vetting to make sure that we're putting the money in the right categories. When you're trying to do a budget every year, if you haven't posted your actuals, your real expenses in the right line, it's really hard to predict what your expenses are going to be. So we're trying to really revisit those and make sure that we're accounting for things in the right place.
Okay, I was just a little concerned when I saw them blank, and
Right.
I just wanted to be sure.
No, that's a really good question.
While we paused, I had a question, if you
Yes.
don't mind, please. For, it looks like soccer fees, our fiscal year projected is $823, but our budget was almost 12 grand, and we're projecting 11.5 again for next year. I'm just trying to figure out why.
That's another item that they've been getting posted in a kind of a mishmash way. So we have like sponsor fees, general income sports, soccer fees, those have not always hit the right line. So we're trying to make sure that we're getting things in the right line. On the general income with sports for 23, the number's staying higher because we had to order, we're going to need to spend more on uniforms for the participants, but they also put in a fee for that. So there's an offsetting number for that, but that's the line it falls in. Ordinarily, it wouldn't be that large, 17,000. So I think what has happened is in 22, a lot of the fees got put into this general income line, so that 17 is artificially high. It just is a coincidence that the number for 23 is also 17, but that has to do with the uniforms.
So we
If
didn't
I can-
actually spend
I can-
17 this
Yeah,
year?
I can help a little bit. I mean, I don't know if y'all remember where we had the old codes and the new codes and all of that, and some of the things kind of coded not where they should be. Some of this is due to that. So the projections for one line item isn't really the way the budget should be set up next year. We're trying to make it correct, so that's why the projection doesn't always fall in line with how we're budgeting next year.
So we don't have a huge increase like it
Right.
appears we do here. It looks like it's about the same, it's just it's being
Right.
coded
Ashley
differently.
Yeah.
explained that much better than
Okay,
I.
thank you.
And then when we look at expenditures by category, when we're looking at municipal budgeting, the biggest expense is people. So it makes it hard to cut your budget because so much of it is people. It doesn't leave you a lot of other places to cut back. So particularly this year, when we're looking at raises for the employees, that means we have to be really careful in all of our other categories, which, as you can see, none of which are really large. So it's kind of a big puzzle to put together. So the largest expenses outside of personnel, there's a whole category of lots of little things that make up like other operating, for example, that are all under, $100,000. But, things that you would think would be really large in the big scope of things aren't. Like utilities are only 2% of our budget. It's a big dollar number, but when you look at it in the whole scope, it's not as much as you'd expect. Same with fuel and oil. Now, when we get into the other funds, you're going to see those numbers be a larger percent because you're operating equipment and you're running the water and sewer plants that use a lot of utilities. So that will shift some. But when you're looking at just our general office space, those aren't very high. And professional services and contract services tend to be higher on the general fund side as a percentage, because that's when we're using consultants and contractors to help us do things administratively, more in the office, planners and engineers and things like that. So you see that a little bit as a larger percentage on the general fund. When you look at the departments within the general fund, police is the largest component. It's about 41% at about 2.2 million. And you can see the numbers go down as we get all the way down to human resources. And I'm going to go through each of these departments independently so we can take a look at them. And if you have questions about any of the line items, let me know and we can talk through those. But as you can see, police is the largest one. And as a small city, each of the other areas only has a handful of employees too. So it's going to lower the budget a little bit too. So we'll start with the city commission. As you can see, the budget in 22 is $59,423 for personnel. That shouldn't change. Your you're get the same salary you budgeted. We did project in this number in the 61,079 for personnel for the commission, a 3% increase like all the other employees. And I think I mentioned last time that if we wanted to change it to put you at market, as is shown below, at $1,125 per commissioner per month and $1,250 for the mayor per month, then that would be about a $12,000 increase for the year. So that is not built in, the 3% is built in, so that is obviously entirely up to you as a body. And then the city clerk's budget, at the end of this calendar year, Jenny's going to be retiring, so we'll have a PTO sick leave payout, I know, and we'll also have some overlap of a new person. So she'll be here for 1 quarter of the year, so we have her salary for that quarter, but we hope to have somebody for the whole year that can train with her as well. So there will be some overlap, so that's why you see an increase in 23. And again, there's one-time money in there for the payout, so once that's done, the budget will go back down a little bit. In the city manager's office, there's again, like all of these, the raises are included in that with the step placement. The one item that we did change in the city manager's budget was to reduce the contingency line, and it was budgeted for $39,270. We've only spent $2,777 in 22, so we went ahead and put that down at $5,000. My understanding is that's for all of you if there's something that comes up that you need, so by all means give us feedback on that if that's not what you want to do with that line item.
Can you, didn't we put code in there too? Oh, or was that planning? That was planning.
It's
Sorry.
in planning,
Okay.
yes ma'am. And then the city attorney, obviously this is a professional service, third parties managing this. In 22, we have a little higher on the non-routine services because the work that was done on the mural ordinance. And then we assume that the budget's going to continue the same for 23. Human resources falls under the clerk's office, so there's no personnel in this section. It's already been covered by the clerk and deputy clerk. And then the operating expenses are covering things like posting jobs, doing the pre-employment physicals, employee engagement, outreach, things like that. Well, and this is an example. You can see that we've cut this one back a little bit. So we sat down with Jenny and Angela and really went through and tried to back off what we could. It's a really small budget, but we cut it down as much as we could and still perform the functions needed. And that one's easier to see because there's not as many line items in it. Some of them, you're adding to one, taking off from another, and you don't really see the changes as much. In finance, we've had a lot of transition, obviously, with employees. We added an accountant this year, and the step placement and raises are also built in. And then in license and billing, the front counter downstairs. In 22, we had a lot of overtime. We had a lot of turnover. And we also had half of Grace's budget in utility billing and half in finance, and I just went ahead and moved it all into finance. So you'll see a little bit of reduction from that, and also from the reduction in overtime that we're anticipating. We are staffing up. We have a new person we hired a couple weeks ago who's doing great, and we're looking to hire one more person. So we're not going to see the overtime we saw last year. And then the police department, again, personnel is the biggest portion of this budget, and with the raises built in, we're at about 1.7 million. And the operating expenses don't have a huge increase. We're really looking at the property and liability insurance and the vehicle maintenance as the bigger components of that section. The capital outlay is their radio leases, and the vehicle leases, obviously that's vehicle leases, but we do anticipate that going up a little bit this year. Again, we have a lot of older vehicles that are outside the lease program, so we continue to discuss how to manage that. And then the planning department, as Ashley mentioned, we are moving the code enforcement position from the police department over to planning so it can report directly to the city manager. And we also moved, we had a small line item of for expenses for that employee, and we've moved those with the position as well. Information technology, 22 looks really high. We had a lot of IT projects that hadn't been charged back to the departments directly, so they really drove up that number. And when we get into 23, we've moved everything into the right departments. We're charging directly to the departments and less to IT. We also had, because of all the turnover in finance particularly, we had a lot of extra training for staff in the last year or two, so that has pushed up that 22 number as well. The operating line is mostly PC or laptops and monitors. And then the cemetery fund, as I mentioned earlier, that could be funded through the cemetery trust, so we'll take a look at that and figure out what the best recommendation would be. And then roads and streets, this is just the operating side of the roads and streets. This is not going to be your capital projects of repairing roads. Those are going to come up on 2 weeks from now, in 2 weeks when we have the next meeting. Again, property and liability insurance happen to catch roads and streets a little bit higher than some of the areas, and they also have the same problem with the aging equipment. We had about $31,000 of extra repairs during the year that we didn't anticipate because of equipment. And facilities, obviously they're the ones that make sure that all our AC units work and that we have what we need to function. They manage the roof project, things like that. And we're hoping that 23 will be a little bit better where we don't have big projects. We did have to have AC repairs in a couple areas this year, so that added to our budgets. Public information officer, Kevin is not included in this as a salary because his salary is captured in fire and the city manager's office budgets. This is just the operating side of it. And we are moving a vehicle into that area so that it's available to him and maybe used by other areas as well. And then Parks and Rec, I think I mentioned last time we are looking at adding one FTE for an administrative clerk that would work in Parks and Rec, and they would be split funded between the general fund and wild spaces since they would do work for both areas or projects funded on both sides. Again, property and liability insurance has gone up. The sports uniform demand and prices have increased, so we added to the operating budget on this side with an equal amount on the revenue side because those will be paid for with the fees coming in. And then the farmers market, not a lot happening here. We have the raises included in this budget. And then with stopping the FABS program, there's a reduction on the expenses there. And that is the last slide of the departments. So I'm happy to answer any questions or go into more detail where you'd like.
Mayor? Yes. Hi, Diane.
Hi.
You mentioned, I saw the figure in the city attorney You mentioned that the murals had a great deal with, do you have a figure on that so far?
I don't, that was the largest special project that wasn't part of their regular routine work, but I don't know that we've been billed for that yet. I don't recall. I'd have to go back and look. Do you remember, Ashley?
Yeah, we've been billed for some of it. And I approved that expense since there were so many legalities involved, and I didn't feel like it was in my purview to make some of those legal decisions that position should be making.
I don't have a problem with it as far as
Yeah.
paying for what they're doing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to know if there's a figure.
It's kind of, there wasn't given one overall figure for the total amount. I don't see.
Well,
I mean, I
and it's
think,
ongoing too.
yeah,
so-
it's the last amount, exactly. The last amount I remember coming through was around $5,000 that we had spent year to date, might give or take a little bit. So it depends how quickly it's wrapped up. I see it being under 10,000 overall for the whole budget year.
Okay, thank you.
We're adding a vehicle for the PIO.
We're actually moving it from one department to another. And Bruce, I can't remember for the life of me which area we moved the PIO vehicle from. Was it CRA? Okay.
Fire.
Vehicle was out of fire, but right now we currently reimburse him for mileage as he does special projects and goes around to different things and things along those lines. So the cost was a wash at that point in time.
On your pie chart with all of the breakdown, we had 2% for debt service.
Yep.
Can you tell me what that reflects?
So debt service on the general fund side, let me look real quick. Oh, I know what that is. So the way our system has all of the vehicle leases set up, they're shown as debt. So those are all the vehicle leases. The boring side of that is under new accounting rules, they'll be categorized as debt. That's a long story, but anyway.
And I'm thinking if we wanted to save the city just a little bit of money, Jenny could just stay.
I know.
You know. Jenny.
If that's a motion, I'll second.
I'm sorry, I had another question. On the SRO line item here for the two schools, the schools are reimbursing that money, is that correct?
That's correct. So
Okay.
that's revenue coming into us to pay for the officers that
Gotcha.
we send to the schools, yes.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Audience?
It does not hurt my feelings to have a brief presentation.
Can I ask one more question? I'm
You
sorry.
can ask all you, I mean, no.
Can you
please.
explain to me the difference in a raise and a step placement
Yes.
adjustment?
So a pay study was done to see where our position, the pay range that we should have for all of our employees. And then Angela and Jenny worked together to develop the steps. So if you're, let's say it takes 10 years to master a position, there's 10 steps. And if a person has 5 years in that position, they would go to the 5th step. And so that's where they should be. So it's kind of like putting them at market. And so under this model, we moved those people into the correct steps. If they were already making more than the first step, we left them where they were. So nobody's getting reduction if they happen to hit a step, you know, hit a range that would cause that. So there's various movements. Not everybody's going to move. A lot of people move, but not everybody will. And again, it's based on the pay study and where they belong in that series.
It was also for internal equity purposes. You know, sometimes when you do hiring, things start getting askew. So you want to, you know, every now and then go realign to establish the internal equity between positions and what people do, and to be competitive. I mean, we are having some hiring issues in certain departments because overall we were behind several other cities on our starting pay. And so we need to be able to hire some good people. And that was one of the issues with some of the positions that have gone out in the last year.
And that step adjustment and 3% raise represents probably the most significant increase from last year's budget to this year.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that the fact that we're putting money into the people is a good thing.
I agree.
Yeah, we couldn't do as many projects like we went. The LDC is going to be challenging this year. It's going to be a little more work. All the other departments have put a little bit more work on themselves so that, you know, we could take care of the employees this year, if y'all approve.
And the 3% was important too, back to Ashley's point about compression. So if you just start moving people, sometimes it really gets out of sync. So what we did was a step first and then moved everybody 3%. That way everybody's where they belong and then everybody got the raise. So it kind of reset the relationship. Because we've really looked at that a lot and had a lot of conversations about compression where you don't want somebody, you know, getting a raise and then they're making 25 cents less than their boss who's been there a long time just because that, you know, the way it came out, so.
And one good example of that would be like police and fire right now. Market value for them is about $7,000 below where they should be. So we weren't able to make that adjustment to total $7,000 due to budget constrictions. So working with the PBA and going through the union steps and things like that, the market value for like PD will go up to $40,000. They should be sitting somewhere around $42,000 to be competitive in the area. So with that compression idea is if we went all the way up, you would have officers with 3 or 4 years of experience making $800,000-$900,000 more than what starting would be. So we had to bring it back, and we'll have to do some more adjustments next year just to get it in the market value.
And the cities that were used were the cities that were chosen from a previous pay plan and previous study that y'all did years ago. So we used the same cities.
But currently, both unions, ASME union and the PBA, are on board with what we're doing. We should have MOUs taken care of within the contracts. So we're not anticipating any issues for what we're doing this year with any of the unions or having any holdouts.
What kind of feedback are you guys getting from people who work here? I mean, obviously, they've been involved in the conversation, I assume. Are you getting positive feedback?
I mean, the majority, I believe, you know, the department heads are all on the same page, I would say is a pretty good representation of that. Majority of the employees are okay where we're at. They all know we can't get there tomorrow. Very similar conversations with the unions as well. You know, it took a long time to get where we're at. It's going to take not as long to get to where we need to be, but we got to make those adjustments. And the unions are the biggest hurdle. They're working with us, and it seems to be very cohesive between two groups right now, and everybody seems to be on the same page. So I don't anticipate anything this year. Any issues, we'll have to do some adjustments again next year just to get the starting and everybody up a little bit more to keep that compression from happening, and we should be okay.
And to let you know, I mean, there's always some people who are going to be really happy. I think for the most part, people are satisfied because they see we're moving in the right direction. We're really trying. But there are always a few outliers who think they should be put somewhere that they ended up not being put in because of how the market in the study ended up showing. So just to put that out there.
At the end of the day, though, employee retention is still a lot cheaper than having to keep hiring and hiring and hiring.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
Yes.
Talking about employee retention, I did a little survey this afternoon, and we had a record-breaking, since 2020, we've lost 41 employees. That's a lot of employees for a small town like us.
We only
Yes,
have
it is.
80-ish, so that's half, yeah.
In my 13 years as your fire chief previously, I've never had an issue hiring firefighters, and we haven't been able to hire any. We've had 2 open positions for almost 5 months now. And the issue is, and I know Chief Shepard was having the same problem. He's got fortunate, some people, with some hires he's had. And I mean, you look around the surrounding areas right now with what they're paying, even going to some of the smaller county agencies. I mean, they're at 45, 50. I mean, Dixie County right now is paying paramedic firefighter $55,000 a year. they're paying their starting deputies 45 or 47? 45. Gilchrist County's doing the same thing. Now, we don't expect to be there, so the 42 puts us in the market. It puts us in line with like what Alachua was doing and Green Cove and some things that are similar to our size. And that's where the retention's going to come into play. But if we keep losing our key players and staff, it's just we're going to keep being this constant hiring.
Is it a reasonable comparison, though, to compare a city staff to another county? Because, I mean, if we had the fire department become a county instead of a city, that would change the whole narrative.
Well, yes and no. When I'm talking county departments, I'm looking at smaller counties. Gilchrist County doesn't have, I think what are they, like 25,000 citizens. It's not a large county. Their staffing levels are very similar to ours, and that's at a county. Same thing with like Dixie County. Their staffing levels are relatively the same on the fire and law enforcement side to what we have. So looking at the rural county support, they got stuff we weren't eligible for. You know, they got a one-time adjustment from the state of Florida to make these adjustments in pay. But their pay was comparative to where we were at. But then you look at Alachua, they're making more than we are. Alachua County is going to pay more than what we're paying. I mean, that's just the way it's going to be. There's nothing we can do, but we're comparable. You know, we're right around with the adjustments, right around where Newberry's paying. So those are comparable to what we're looking at.
Anything else? Any other questions? That's 4-1. That's shocking. 4-1. That's what's it is. It says.
I mean, you're combating $15 an hour too, so that makes everybody's starting pay $31,200. So I mean, that's minimum wage at this point, and then we have to be there in the next couple of years regardless. So this just gives us a jump ahead of time, getting it starting on the smaller end to get it done instead of having to figure out how to retain and go after new employees when we get there.
And the other issue is because the pay, the quality of people coming in, you know, some of the resumes coming in, the qualifications aren't the same because the people with qualifications are going to the cities that are paying more. So then when you get those resumes, you start looking through, you're like, nothing's working. I mean, it's really hard. So. And to some extent, you get what you pay for, too. And you end up, because then you end up having to train. And once you get them trained, they want to go somewhere else, so.
I mean, when I started working for the city, I was making $6.25 an hour just a couple days ago. Antoine, you were right there with me, weren't you? About $7, $7.17, somewhere in there? About $8. I mean, and we're talking in the last 20 years, so just the adjustments we're having to make.
Yes. And that's understandable. Because what a gallon of milk costs.
Yeah, and then you're just having to wait to hire what you need. Then other employees are having to take on more. And then you're like, I hope I don't lose these employees because now they're working triple time because they were already carrying multiple positions. And it's just this whole, it's not good. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
All that do is worry everybody and take your operating costs up higher.
Yep.
I always just say, you're building your resume. You're building your resume.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
That's a good way to look at it.
That's a good one.
Yes, absolutely.
But you want happy employees from the state. You got, and you know, people got to feed their families.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. If there's nothing else,
Good job. Good job.
anything else?
No.
Then
Entertain.
I'll make a motion that we adjourn.
All right.